Order. Dr. Roz Savage to move the motion.
Thank you, Chair. I beg to move that this House has considered E-petition number 701963 relating to geo-engineering and the environment. The petition was started by Antoinette Taylor and was opened on the 23rd of December 2024. As of the 12th of June, it had gathered over 159,000 signatures. Just 2 of those signatures were from my constituency of the South Cotswolds, so clearly I didn't step up to lead this debate in an effort to win votes. I'm here because I believe this issue matters deeply for our future and for the future of the planet on which we rely for life. Geoengineering is a broad term used to describe a range of large-scale interventions in Earth's climate system. So I'm going to start by clarifying a couple of definitions. Geoengineering falls into 2 main categories: carbon dioxide removal, or CDR, and solar radiation management, or SRM. And the petition calls for a preemptive ban on both of these. CDR is about drawing carbon out of the atmosphere. This can involve technology like carbon capture or nature-based solutions, such as restoring forests, peatlands, and grasslands. I have absolutely no problem with the latter. Trees don't need subsidies and peatlands do not break. And healthy soils not only store carbon, but they also improve water quality, mitigate flooding and support biodiversity. They are our natural allies in our fight against climate change. SRM, however, is a different matter. It aims to reflect sunlight back into space by various means, such as using aerosols sprayed into the stratosphere, whitening clouds, or even placing mirrors in orbit. SRM doesn't remove carbon. It doesn't stop ocean acidification. It doesn't reduce fossil fuel use. It masks the symptoms while the root cause, our fossil fuel emissions, our carbon emissions, goes unchecked. So whatever options we are looking at as we confront the climate crisis, we mustn't distract from our overriding mission, which is to tackle the key cause of climate change, our reliance on fossil fuels. So let's talk about the risks of SRM. First, there is the issue of unintended consequences. And humanity does not have a good track record on this. Our weather systems are immensely complex, interconnected, and not well understood. Altering sunlight could potentially disrupt monsoons or shift jet streams or trigger droughts in some regions while causing floods in others. According to the House of Commons Science and Technology Committee, SRM could delay ozone recovery by decades. It could disrupt rainfall patterns. And it would do nothing to stop carbon dioxide from being absorbed by our oceans, forming the carbonic acid that's affected the viability of phytoplankton. And those phytoplankton are essential for life on Earth. They generate half of the oxygen that we breathe. There's also the problem of scientific control. With SRM, we can't conduct a controlled experiment. We don't have 2 planets, one on which we conduct SRM and one on which we don't. There is no planet B to test this on. Once deployed, we're effectively launching a planetary experiment with no ability to reverse if things go wrong. As the petitioners have highlighted, even if SRM works, in quotes, in the short term, there's a risk that our climate would become dependent on continual injections. If the injections stop for any reason, which in our turbulent geopolitical world is entirely possible, we would risk a phenomenon known as termination shock, a sudden extreme spike in global temperatures, which would be potentially catastrophic for life on Earth. As to the actual chemicals being used in SRM, the aerosols under consideration include sulfates and even aluminium. This is still being researched, and there is no definitive link between aluminium and conditions like Alzheimer's, but many scientists remain cautious about prolonged exposure. And sulfates are precisely the chemicals we worked so hard to eliminate under the Montreal Protocol, because of their role in depleting the ozone layer. We should consider carefully that deploying SRM could put us in direct violation of that protocol, one of the most successful international environmental agreements ever forged. And we must consider the human cost of climate change and any measures that we might take to mitigate it. Who decides the thermostat setting? Who gets more rain and who goes without? Can we even control these things? The risks of failing to invest in technology to tackle the root causes of climate change threaten serious regional disruption. And as always, it will almost certainly be the poorest and the least responsible for the crisis who bear the brunt of the fallout. Some will argue that we're still doing too little, too late to mitigate climate change. And I would agree with them. But that does not mean that SRM is the right answer. SRM could take us out of the frying pan and into the fire. So I believe that instead of reaching for techno fixes, we need to do what we already know works. Cut fossil fuel use, restore nature, and gosh, maybe even look at changing our behaviour. Because at some point, sooner or later, behaviour change must be part of the picture. If we're honest, none of the technologies as yet available to us, not even the most advanced forms of carbon removal, can keep pace with our current levels of consumption. Globally, we're still emitting around 40 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide every year. If we continue on our current path, which is an environmental campaign of over 2 decades, I very much hope that we don't, then we're headed for around 2.7 degrees of warming by the end of the century. We know that the consequences of that level of warming include rising seas, more intense storms, loss of crop yields, mass displacement of humans, accelerating biodiversity loss, and heat waves that will put many, many lives at risk. And while carbon capture is often talked about as a solution, the reality, the present reality, is sobering. While carbon capture is less perilous for sure than SRM, the vast majority of carbon capture projects are still very small scale. Many of them use almost as much energy to capture carbon dioxide as was emitted in the first place. To scale this up to a level where we could even begin to think about continuing business as usual would require enormous infrastructure, energy and funding. And meanwhile, it's increasingly clear that we have to transition away from fossil fuels. And I'm not talking ideologically, but economically. The energy return on fossil fuels is falling. In the early days of oil, when we could just stick a nodding donkey in the ground anywhere in Texas and hit oil, we got about 100 barrels out for every barrel's worth of energy invested. Today, that figure is down from 100 to closer to 20 and still falling. At some point, the economics will simply stop making sense. Fossil fuels are finite and the cost of extraction is rising. So given that we know that we're going to have to make this transition at some point, sooner or later, why not do it sooner? So it's really not a question of if we'll move on, it's a question of whether we'll do it on our terms or wait until crisis forces our hand. Some will argue that we live on a planet where climate has always changed, but historically it's changed slowly, giving species time to adapt. And the most dramatic climatic shifts took place before humans came on the scene. Our Western civilization has evolved during an unusually stable climatic period, the Holocene. Our infrastructure, our food systems, our settlements, all of them were built around that stability. Shake the foundations and the whole structure becomes precarious. The rate of change we're seeing now is absolutely unprecedented in human history. And ironically, that puts us, in many ways, the most adaptable of species, amongst the most vulnerable of species on the planet right now. But I want to end on a positive note. This is not a story of despair. The situation is urgent, yes, for sure, but it is not hopeless. If we act boldly and act now, we can still turn this around. Let's redirect investment away from planetary scale experiments of dubious feasibility. And I'm not for a moment saying that we are investing in that at the moment. I'm just saying let's shift our focus away from technologies that may or may not deliver benefits and may or may not deliver catastrophic side effects. Let's instead focus on realistic, viable solutions that we already know work. Let's prioritise emissions cuts, the restoration of nature and behavioural shifts. Let's resist the easy temptation of silver bullets and choose instead the hard but honest work of transition. Because what's at stake is not just the climate, but our shared future. Not just statistics, but stories of people, places and ecosystems that deserve to survive and to thrive. I'd like to finish by quoting the American farmer, poet and activist, Wendell Berry. The care of the earth is our most ancient and most worthy, and after all, our most pleasing responsibility. To cherish what remains of it and to foster its renewal is our only legitimate hope. Thank you, Chair.
Members that they should bob if they wish to be called in the debate. I will call...
You need to propose a question.
Oh, yeah, I've forgotten that bit. The question is that this House has considered E-petition 701963 relating to geo-engineering and the environment. I will call Pippa Halings.
Thank you, Chair, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairship. I think it's important to set this debate and the e-petition in the context of the last couple of weeks. So this last weekend saw another hottest day of the year on record, triggering an official heat wave and accompanied by an amber heat health warning, which means that significant impacts are likely across health and social care services because of high temperatures, including a rise in deaths, particularly among those aged 65 and over or people with health conditions. The Met Office now puts the chance of us seeing another 40-degree weather event at 50-50, with a 45-degree day on the cards in the current climate. That's an average summer day in Death Valley. And I can't really imagine how the people and the natural environment in South Cambridgeshire, my constituency, or the rest of the UK could cope with that. As well as record-breaking temperatures, this weekend has brought an increase in a threat of greater destabilisation in the Middle East, with escalating conflict between Israel, US and Iran. Unsurprisingly, oil prices soared on Sunday night to the highest price since President Trump's return to office, as the energy markets digested the attacks on nuclear facilities in Iran. We don't know yet whether the situation in the Middle East will lead to an oil supply shock. The Iranian parliament has threatened to close the Strait of Hormuz, which would choke the flow of oil from the region. And the result? Ordinary people will once again face volatile prices, hitting their pockets, energy becoming more expensive, and the cost of living exacerbated. So over just one weekend, Madam Chair, we've seen our vulnerability to extreme weather conditions as a result of our failure to tackle climate change, and also our vulnerability as a result of our dependence on global fossil fuel supply and prices. This just underlines once again our need to strengthen our own homegrown energy security and reduce our polluting emissions by accelerating on investment in renewables and clean, green energy. But our emissions are not falling fast enough. Madam Chair, we are not on track to meet our legally binding climate targets. The world is set to surpass 1.5 degrees of warming in the next decade. And this is the context in which this petition is being brought forward. We do need to address the root causes of climate breakdown, as my honourable friend from the South Cotswolds has said. The Committee on Climate Change was very clear last year that only a third of the emissions reductions required to achieve the country's climate targets are currently covered by credible plans. Whilst it's true that the country's emissions are now less than half the levels they were in 1990, largely due to the phase-out of coal and the ramping up of renewables, We will now need to see ambitious action, not just in the energy sector, but also across transport, buildings, industry and agriculture. And the plans that were left in place from the previous government just did not deliver enough action. So we must do more. Nevertheless, even with aggressive investment in renewables and actions to decarbonise key sectors, there will still be residual emissions to deal with from heavy industries, particularly aviation, but also shipping and steel. The balanced pathway developed in the Committee for Climate Change's 7th carbon budget tries to reduce emissions across all sectors of the economy as far as credibly possible, in line with cost effectiveness and feasibility constraints, minimising the use of engineered removals. However, even the Committee on Climate Change recognises that we do need to go beyond cutting emissions, and we will need to start work on engineered removals, removing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. And that is why this is part of the government's net zero strategy. As we have heard, geo-engineering refers to deliberate large-scale projects to reduce carbon and to cool the Earth's climate system to address climate change, which in greenhouse gas removal terms also includes direct air capture and bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, some of which we're already using. And we've seen sizable investments from the government into carbon capture storage, which could accommodate large-scale BECCS and DACs, which will be clearly dependent on carbon capture and storage. This is a measure of last resort for those hard to decarbonise sectors. Living in South Cambridgeshire, I'm close to the border with Cambridge, which hosts the University of Cambridge, which since 2019, under climate expert Professor Sir David King, has been undertaking some important research into greenhouse gas research at the Centre for Climate Repair. And they've been looking, amongst others, at something which brings climate and nature approaches into balance again and together. For example, marine biomass regeneration, aiming to restore whale populations and ocean biomass to boost nutrient recycling and phytoplankton growth, because healthier oceans can naturally absorb more carbon dioxide and support global climate goals. Also, they've been looking at the role of giant kelp, which grows rapidly and captures large amounts of carbon dioxide. When it sinks to the ocean floor, it stores carbon long-term, offering a powerful nature-based carbon removal method. And these are just two of the types of approaches that are being investigated. Quite rightly, the government funded an independent review of greenhouse gas removal approaches, led by former MP Dr. Alan Whitehead, covering nature-based solutions and engineered removals like direct air capture. We saw in the government's response to this E-petition that it's currently working with the British Standards Institution to develop greenhouse gas removal methodologies. As we've seen, some which may use sustainable biomass and coming up with biomass sustainability criteria. So there are some ways in which we could see greenhouse gas removal as a kind of guardrail for helping to decarbonise the atmosphere. However, this E-petition also makes reference to solar radiation modification, and this is an area that causes more concern. The government has announced that it's not in favour of using SRM and has no plans for its full deployment. This position, I think, was made clear by the Minister for Climate in January. And that the SRM research ongoing is only for modelling only. That would be in accordance with our own views on the matters of SRM, Chair. And we think that these is one of the last researches that shouldn't actually go to full deployment. We also think that actually the money invested in the research for SAM could have been better allocated to other measures for dealing with nature-based removal. I do agree with Professor Mike Hume that this research is an extraordinary amount of taxpayer money to invest in speculative technology. And he's right to call for, as I've already said, this money to be better to spend to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels or to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. In conclusion, geoengineering is not a silver bullet, and it must never be used as an excuse to delay decarbonisation through embracing and investing in renewables. We must remember that the key here is to fight against climate change and the root causes of climate change, secure energy security, and invest in the transition to renewable and climate energy. Any amount of greenhouse gas removal will ultimately compromise the fight against climate change. As Dr. Vaughan from the Tyndall Centre said, SRM methods do not address the causes of climate change. However, a blanket ban on geo-engineering, as this motion proposes, would be short-sighted and self-defeating as we explore the other methods that I have discussed. Therefore, let's champion governance built on transparency for any kind of research and standards in geoengineering, but climate action that is ambitious and grounded in our transition to homegrown, clean, green energy. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Fennis. I'm pleased to respond to this brief debate on geoengineering and the environment, and I congratulate the Honourable Member for the South Cotswolds for starting the debate. I agree with her that solar radiation management would be a reckless experiment that risks all our futures. And I know that the member for South Cambridgeshire used the opportunity to speak about climate change. And while she and I probably disagree very profoundly about the wisdom of the net zero target and the plan to decarbonise the whole grid by 2030, I'm sure she opposes, like I do, the giant solar and battery farms the government wants to impose on both of our constituencies and most of the east of England. My party's position on SRM is clear. We oppose any attempts to seed the sky, and every effort must be made to be respectful of nature and our planet. Chasing harebrained scientific schemes such as these to interfere with the climate and the atmosphere will not give us answers to any live public policy dilemmas. The Met Office has confirmed that we don't have enough evidence to understand how effective geoengineering like SRM might be, and we don't know what unintended consequences might occur for human and environmental health. I know ministers have said that there are no plans to fund experimentation with solar radiation modification, but public concern was prompted by ARIA offering £56.8 million of public money to examine climate cooling theory. It's important to say that this research does not, as far as I'm aware, include any actual attempts to manipulate the climate in practice, but was a study in relation to the theory of these methods. Having been very clear about the Conservative position, I'd like to invite the Minister to provide a clear statement that the government will not support SRM. And given the concern expressed by the public through this petition and with members of the public attending today, I'm sure she will want to give everybody a very unambiguous reassurance that that is indeed the case and that the government will not be coming forward with such methods. Thank you.
Thank you. A pleasure to see you in the chair, as always. And I want to start by congratulating the Honourable Member for South Cotswolds for leading this debate. And I think for showing respect for the notion behind the petition, because that isn't always the case when people come and present views. And I hope the petitioners feel that she's done justice to their stance. I'm going to start out I'm going to set out in my speech what we're doing to tackle the issues that were highlighted in the petition. I know that a lot of the concerns that have been raised today and over the last few weeks have been driven by recent research proposals to explore climate cooling technologies, as well as the media coverage that this has caused. And I will come on to those concerns in a moment. But I'll start by defining geoengineering. It's a term that's commonly used to refer to two groups of technologies, as been mentioned by previous speakers: greenhouse gas removals and solar radiation modification. And these are two very separate, very different approaches to addressing climate change. And the UK has two very separate, very different positions on their use. Greenhouse gas removals actively remove greenhouse gases, predominantly carbon dioxide, from the atmosphere for highly durable storage, resulting in negative emissions. They're vital to achieving net zero, and we support their deployment. Solar radiation modification, on the other hand, describes a set of interventions that aim to cool the Earth, largely by reflecting some of the sun's energy back into space.
On that point, with my honourable friend, intervention. Thank you, Chair, and thank the Minister. I receive communication on a regular basis from constituents asking me about my opinion on the UK Government's involvement in chemtrails and geoengineering. Can I seek the Minister's assurances that chemtrails are actually condensation trails and nothing to do with solar radiation management? And as far as SRM is concerned, the UK Government has not deployed the techniques and has no plans to do so.
I can certainly reassure the honourable member, and I've had quite a lot of this correspondence. MPs have passed on the correspondence from their constituents, and I both answered written questions which are in the public domain and replied to that correspondence on both these points. I will come on to trying to express as absolutely clearly and vehemently as I can that we have no plans for SRM. On the chemtrails, supposed chemtrails issue, it is a term that's used by some people who claim that it's the white trails that you see trailing behind high altitude aircraft on a clear day. There were some that concerned that they contain undisclosed chemical agents that are intended for a covert atmospheric spraying programme. They are, in fact, as the honourable member says, contrails, which form when warm and moist aircraft exhaust fumes mix with cold air at altitude. Under certain atmospheric conditions, contrails can persist and spread out to form cirrus-like clouds before disappearing. There is no deliberate spraying of chemicals in our skies over the UK for climate modification. So to return to what I was saying about, I've just said that we're not in favour of SRM and have no plans to change the position. I will say more in a moment. But I just want to say a bit more on greenhouse gas removals. Making Britain a clean energy superpower is one of the 5 missions of this government, delivering clean power by 2030 and accelerating to net zero across the economy by 2050. And I note the comments by the Honourable Member of South Cambridgeshire about the UK being off track to do that. We will be publishing our carbon budget delivery plan by October, and that is something that, as she said, the previous government was taken to court for failing to come up with adequate policies to match the ambition, and obviously there's no point setting targets unless you can deliver on those targets, and we will be setting out a plan in due course, as well as then going on to talk about Carbon Budget 7 and meeting our nationally determined contributions as well. We must do everything we can to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. That is absolutely our starting point, that we need that effort share across all government departments, and we need everyone to play a role. Yes, happy.
Thank you very much. And I hope this isn't too much of a diversion, but you will know that that mains gas is 6p a kilowatt, and that is largely imported, and it is certainly a carbon fuel. Renewable energy is selling at 24p a kilowatt. We really cannot get the public behind us as long as the environmental tariffs are on the renewable energy and not on the carbon fuel. May I have your opinion of that? Thank you.
Well, I won't intend to go too far down that path, other than to say that is very much on our radar, that we need to make sure that the cost, we know that renewables are the cheaper option, but that needs to be reflected in the price that's charged to people. Today we announced measures in our industrial strategy about bringing down energy prices for industry as part of industrial decarbonisation, but on the consumer side, that's work in progress, and he can expect to hear more soon. As I said, the starting point is reducing emissions, but we know that there's some sectors that are hard to abate, and we won't be able to do that fully, and therefore greenhouse gas removal technologies will be important for helping us to balance those residual emissions. This is recognised internationally by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and also by our own Independent Climate Change Committee. The Climate Change Committee's latest advice to government for setting Carbon Budget 7 modelled around 36 megatons per year of engineered removals by 2050 to help us reach net zero. Greenhouse gas removals approaches fall broadly into two categories. There's nature-based approaches, such as afforestation, and there's engineering-based approaches, such as direct air carbon capture and storage, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, biochar, and enhanced rock weathering. Nature-based approaches, which I know both the Honourable Member for South Cotswolds and the Honourable Member for South Cambridgeshire are passionate about, can play a really important role in removing and storing carbon dioxide at scale, while delivering a range of additional environmental improvements, such as improvements in biodiversity, air quality and soil health. And those co-benefits are really important as well. We are acting upon this. In March this year, we announced the creation of the first new national forest in over 30 years, the Western Forest. That will see 20 million trees planted across the west of England over the coming years. And as a Bristol MP, very much welcome that. We also plan to expand nature-rich habitats such as wetlands and peat bogs. We'll restore hundreds of thousands of hectares of peatlands. That's also something we're seeking to promote on an international scale. So we are in the middle of London Climate Action Week now. We have Brazil, a lot of visitors from Brazil talking about what they're seeking to do at COP30 in terms of their tropical forests forever facility. I was really excited to hear what the Honourable Member had to say about whales and giant kelp. I've been trying to talk to my officials about how these things all play a role, and I think it's good to have scientific backup for my views on that. But the voluntary carbon markets is something that we're focusing on during London Climate Week. The role of the voluntary the voluntary carbon and nature markets in getting investment into blue carbon, into our forests, really important. But we know that nature-based approaches also need to be complemented by engineered solutions to remove carbon dioxide at the speed and scale needed to meet our targets. Many other countries agree with us on the important role GGRs will play, and there's a large-scale removal projects currently operating and being planned around the world. And we're committed to supporting the deployment of engineered GGRs too. Access to CCUS infrastructure is vital for many GGR technologies, and the government is supporting the development of the CCUS network by allocating 9.4 billion in capital budgets over the spending review period. It needs regulation, and we have an established environmental regulatory regime with several regulators that will evaluate the environmental impact of greenhouse gas removal and CCUS projects. Any GGR project deployed in the UK must comply with the relevant regulations and planning processes to ensure they are managed responsibly and address impacts to the environment, including biodiversity, pollution and the impact on local communities. We will continue to work with the necessary departments, regulators and other public bodies to ensure the UK's regulatory environment is well placed to support the deployment of GGRs without causing environmental harm. We take the integrity of removals very seriously. A robust GGR standard, including monitoring, reporting and verification, will be crucial for instilling public and investor confidence that removals from engineered GGR projects are genuine and verifiable. In other words, when someone says they removed 1 tonne of CO2, it has to be at least 1 net tonne of CO2 that is removed from the atmosphere once emissions relating to the entire process are taken into account. And we've commissioned the British Standards Institute to develop those methodologies to assess that. So I'm now turned to solar radiation modification, which I think is the real, although the petition refers to geo-engineering in a broader sense, I think this is what the petition is possibly the reason it's attracted so many signatures. As I mentioned, SRM describes a set of technologies that could cool the Earth largely by reflecting some of the sun's energy back into space. The consequences of SRM are currently poorly understood, with significant uncertainty around the possible risks and impacts of deployment. So let me be clear and place on the record, the government is not deploying solar radiation modification and has no plans to do so. There will be no spraying of chemicals in the skies over the UK for SRM, geoengineering or climate remediation. Our priority is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from human activities and to adapt to the unavoidable impacts of climate change. But we do think that we need to understand the potential risks and impacts of SRM. We may have a very clear commitment not to deploy it, but we need to understand what would happen if other people chose to do so. And that includes engaging with the Met Office Hadley Centre Climate Programme, the Natural Environment Research Council, and the Advanced Research and Invention Agency, ARIA, whose climate cooling research programme, I think, the coverage of that has triggered some of the concerns that we're here to talk about today. ARIA is an independent research body that was set up by the Department of Science, Innovation and Technology. Although it is sponsored by that government department, it has complete autonomy over its project choices. And I think that goes to the point that was said about whether this is the best use of public money. ARIA is responsible for its own choices. ARIA is conducting cautious, controlled research aimed at improving understanding of SRM risks and impacts. It's not deploying SRM technologies. I will repeat, however, this research will not release any toxic materials, nor will it alleviate the urgent need for increased decarbonisation efforts. There is no substitute for decarbonisation, and that is why we are pressing on with our missions for clean power and net zero. So to conclude, the science is clear. Without rapid action, we risk irreversible damage to the planet's biosphere. To halt global warming, the world needs to reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions, and that includes the UK's emissions. I hope that I've reassured honourable members present today and the constituents they represent that the government is not deploying SRM technologies and has no plans to do so, and that the environmental impacts of greenhouse gas removal technologies in the other sense, in terms of being the other wing of geo-engineering, are being and will continue to be monitored as these technologies scale up in the UK. Thank you.
Dr. Roz Savage, reminder, please.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you to the honourable members for their contributions to the debate today. I'd like to thank my honourable friend, the MP for South Cambridgeshire, for highlighting possible solutions, particularly the ocean-based solutions, very dear to my heart. It seems to be one of those rare occasions where we find multi-party consensus on this issue. I was tremendously reassured to hear from the Minister her assurance that there are no plans to deploy SRM in this country. It was interesting to hear a bit more about the work of ARIA, and I trust that the work being done there is not opening a door, because, again, humanity has formed that once we know that something is possible, we're not always very good at holding ourselves back from deploying it. But I trust that there will always be the utmost transparency, and I'm very reassured to hear about the work that the government is doing with the British Standards Institute to ensure that there is full transparency and accountability around the work being done in this domain. If I may just wrap up with a personal reflection. During my years of rowing solo across oceans to raise awareness of our climate and nature issues, I learned the hard way that you can't fight Mother Nature. You can't flout her laws and expect to win. Ultimately, she always has the final word. And the wiser path is to work with her. So I hope that we will continue to emphasise nature-based solutions. You can't ever go wrong with those. I do fully appreciate that this is a climate emergency and that urgent action is needed, but let's not forget that Mother Nature can also be our greatest ally. We need to act, and we need to act urgently, but not with hubris, with humility, courage, and care for the well-being of future generations. Thank you.
The question is that this House has considered E-petition 701963 relating to geo-engineering and the environment. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. I think the ayes have it. Order, order. The sitting stands adjourned.